thought it was going to be when I went in. I got 6 years for distribution and a few other related charges, but once I was in, the warden gave me a choice. Serve the full 6 in a normal wing, or serve 1 in a specialty block. He didn't give me a ton of details about G2 block, though I got the gist of it. I'd be a guinea pig for testing pharmaceuticals and, in return, I'd get a reduced sentence. I accepted the deal. My first 6 months in G2 were fine, bordering on boring. There were 32 of us in the block, and we all had the same daily routine. Wake up, shower, breakfast, free time, yard time, experiments in either group A or B, dinner, free time, lights out. There were occasional variations. Every now and then, there would be morning experiments or even doubles, but usually it was a 3-hour block in the afternoons. We all had single cells. The food was edible, at least, and they even let me have a little TV after my first month. All in all, it could have been worse. The experiments that I participated in were mostly harmless. Medications, usually. The lab coat folks in G2 would have me pop pills, or take injections, or swallow a kaleidoscope of liquids. Then we'd all just wait to see what happened. The testing rooms were comfortable if bland. I'd sit in a white chair, next to a white table, surrounded by white walls. I knew the drug was supposed to be intense if they strapped me in, but 4 out of 5 times, they didn't bother with restraints. I experienced quite a few rashes, headaches, blurry vision, blood coming out of all orifices, excessive sneezing, that kind of stuff. Much worse than the pharmaceutical tests, though, were the psychological experiments. Electroshock therapy was a miserable experience. The sensory deprivation tank was worse. They left me floating in a completely silent, black, empty space for 48 hours. By the time the doctors pulled me out, I'd scratched up the sides of the tank to the point that my fingernails were popping off. But nothing was like the signal and all of the death that came after. The lab techs brought us all into our individual white rooms like usual that day. However, there were no drugs on the table, only a device that reminded me of a metronome. The man overseeing the experiment, a gray-haired doctor I didn't recognize, made it clear I was not to touch the metronome until all of the guards and staff were out of the room. The object had a metal base, maybe stainless steel, and it was shaped like a pyramid. A strip of darker metal ran from the base of the device to the tip. Protruding from that strip was a narrow rod with a strange, circular gadget on top. I waited until they gave me a signal from the intercom. Then I tapped the device. The rod with the circular cap began to rock back and forth horizontally. It reminded me of piano practice when I was a kid, the metronome gently swaying and providing a pace. But this felt different. For one thing, the device was silent. There was no telltale tick, 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 like a true metronome. For another, the rod wasn't moving evenly. It jerked and stuttered like a puppet with uneven strings. Nothing else happened for nearly a minute. Then, suddenly, the room was filled with sound. Flooded with it, not the tick, tick, tick I expected, but a rising whine. The volume of the frequency increased until I was folded up in the corner of the room, hands over my ears, begging for them to turn it off. My eyes were closed until I felt a gentle hand touch my shoulder. It was the gray-haired doctor. The experiment was over, he told me. The room was blessedly silent. I thought they'd take me back to my cell, but instead, they took me into a large holding cell, already full of other prisoners. It was the rest of G2 block. 32 of us total in one big cage. "What's going on?" I asked one of the guards through the bars. He ignored me and left the room with all of the other staff. I was left alone with the other inmates. I grabbed a seat on one of the benches and tried to relax. My ears hurt. They ached, and it was only getting worse. Compared to some of the other guys, though, I was in good shape. I noticed several prisoners twitching, shaking, or talking to themselves. One guy, Robbie, was tapping his fist against his temples. He hit himself harder and harder until one of the other men restrained him. I looked around the room for a camera until I spotted one in the corner outside of the bars. I gestured towards Robbie, but there was no response.
"Too loud! Too loud!"
Robbie yelled, pushing free.
"The signal! Too loud!"
Other prisoners were muttering about a signal, too. Some were bashing their heads against the bars or pulling out their hair. I estimated about half of the guys in the room were losing it.
"Hey!
I shouted, waving at the camera in the corner.
You gotta help us! Get me out of here!"
There was a ringing in my ears, but the chaos in the cell was quickly drowning that out. One of the newer guys on G2, a skinny meth head, was punching the bars. He hit the metal again and again, hard enough that I saw his fingers break. A little man named Stavros was the first to go completely berserk. He leapt on another prisoner and bit the guy's face, tearing off a chunk of skin from his cheek. Everywhere there was noise, screaming, clanging, shouting. I felt an arm wrap around my throat and just as quickly release as my attacker was himself attacked. I backed into a corner and called out for help. Not everyone in the cage was going crazy, but those who were seemed nearly possessed. It might have been the adrenaline warping my perception, but some of the prisoners were changing, growing bigger, nastier, swelling. One of the biggest of the bunch grabbed 2 bars and pulled. To my absolute shock, the metal screeched and gave way, creating a hole the size of a manhole cover. The giant tried climbing through, but he didn't fit. He roared and turned his attention to ripping one of the benches from its vaults. His loss was my gain. I clambered through the opening in the bars and then took off for the door. A red light began flashing and an alarm squealed. They were going to lock down this section of the prison. I'd be trapped.
No, no, please!
I screamed, trying the door. It was locked. I kicked and scratched and yelled at it, but that was no good. Then, I heard something thudding towards me, moving fast. I barely jumped out of the way before the big guy rammed into the door, knocking it flying from its hinges. He stood panting like a bull at a discount rodeo. The man had grown at least a foot taller since we first got into the cells. I risked a glance back and saw that the cage was studded with twisted bars and filled with dead bodies. The few that were still breathing were quickly turning into monsters. Spurts of coarse, dark hair grew on them, or the beginnings of ram's horns or thick antlers. The big man stalked off through the destroyed door, and I followed. For some reason, he ignored me. Maybe he didn't think I was worth his attention. I didn't care, and I wasn't confident the other 5 or 6 creatures back in the cell would be so accommodating. The red lights were still flashing in the hallway, and the sirens still sounded. I figured the big guy could punch us right out of the lockdown. I figured wrong. We hadn't gone more than a dozen yards into the hall before gas began to pump out through the vents. The giant roared, his face longer and larger, more feral than before. The last thing I saw before submitting to the gas was him falling over. I woke up in the prison infirmary. Physically, they told me I was fine. When I asked what happened, they said the experiment ended up causing mass hallucinations. Some prisoners got hurt in the confusion, but nothing serious. And hey, turns out it was my lucky day. They decided I'd served my time, and I was eligible for immediate release. Only thing was, I had to sign a bunch of papers agreeing to stay silent about G2 Block. One peep out of me, and they promised I'd be back for my full sentence with time tacked on for good measure. I asked if I could see some of the other guys from G2. They said no. I signed the papers and left, but I kept an eye out for what I knew was coming. Sure enough, obituaries began to trickle out over the next year. Obituaries for the men I saw die that day in the cell. Most of the posts were short, and I had to find them. That's the thing about prisoners in G2 Block. We were specifically picked because we wouldn't be missed. There wouldn't be too many questions. I knew that my parole was about the world's cheapest bribe, and I knew that they're still watching me. But I have to put this out there. I have to leave some record of what happened, because that ringing in my ears after the test, it never went away. It's only gotten worse. My theory is that the signal is an infection that spreads faster in some people than others. But that's how I feel. Infected and angry.